Get away from my house or I swear I'll call the police.
Jordan Blake's voice trembled as he yelled into the empty night, his hand gripping the baseball bat so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with a fear he had never known. The black SUV sat motionless at the end of his driveway, its tinted windows a dark, ominous barrier, hiding whoever or whatever lurked inside. No headlights, no movement, just an eerie, unyielding presence that felt like a noose tightener. Jordan's heart raced, pounding in his chest like a war drum. This was Maplewood, a town so small and friendly that everyone knew everyone's name, where crime was almost a foreign concept. Yet here he was, standing barefoot on the splintered wooden steps of his humble cottage, facing down something that didn't belong, something that had invaded his life without warning or reason. His mind flashed back to that simple act of kindness, that moment on the lonely country road when he had stopped to help a stranded woman. Could one good deed really set off this nigh? Out of the corner of his eye, Jordan spotted the shadow of movement inside his own home, and for a split second he wondered if he was losing his mind. Was someone already inside? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and he stumbled backward, nearly dropping the bat. Every instinct told him to run, to flee into the woods that surrounded his property, but he couldn't abandon the only place he had. Suddenly, a chill wind blew through the trees, rustling the leaves like whispered threats. His breath came out in shallow gasps, visible in the cold night air. The SUV's engine roared to life, breaking the stillness. Jordan's pulse quickened as the vehicle peeled away, tires screeching, leaving him standing there in the darkness, rattled and exposed. But the fear didn't leave with it. It stayed, a heavy presence in his gut, because he knew, deep down, this Jordan had no idea what he was up against or why he was a target. But he understood one thing with crystal clarity. His life and the lives of those he loved in Maplewood were now caught in the crosshairs of something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. As he stepped back into his cottage and locked the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to unravel. The ripple effects of that one moment on the side of the road had already begun, and there was. But before we dive deeper into this powerful story, take a moment to connect with us. In times like these, it's easy to forget that every place holds its own tales and mysteries. Wherever you are, there's a story unfolding. Give us a glimpse. What's your part of the world like right now? Drop a comment below and let us know. And while you're here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our future stories. We're excited to share this journey with you. The early morning sun filtered through the thin curtains in Jordan Blake's small kitchen, casting golden streaks across the weathered wooden table where he sat, hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. His eyes, heavy from a sleepless night, stayed glued to the window above the sink. Even with the dawn light bathing the world outside, the shadow of fear refused to leave him. His mind replayed the events of the night before, the black SUV, the suffocating silence, and the way his own voice had cracked with terror when he shouted into the darkness. Jordan had never considered himself a fearful man. He had faced the wildest of Maplewood's creatures as a park ranger, snapping wolves, wandering bears, the occasional angry hiker. But this was something else. It felt deeply personal, a darkness that had seeped into the very fabric of his life. The door creaked open behind him, and in walked his younger sister, Chloe Blake, her hair pulled up in a messy bun and eyes still heavy with sleep. "You look like hell," she said, the words softened by the concern in her voice. Jordan tried to smile, but it faltered. "Thanks. Just what I needed to hear." Chloe leaned against the counter, crossing her arms over her sweatshirt. "It's that car, isn't it?" she asked. She didn't have to clarify. Everyone in Maplewood knew about the black SUV that had become an unsettling fixture in their small town. Word traveled fast in a place where the mailman knew every dog's name, and Mrs. Harper at the Maplewood Eatery could predict a rainstorm better than the Weather Channel. Jordan sighed, running a hand over his unshaven face. "Yeah, it followed me last night, parked at the end of the driveway, just sitting there." Chloe's eyes narrowed, her worry deepening. "You think it's connected to that woman you helped?" His chest tightened. "I don't know," he admitted. "But something tells me it is." A tense silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional chirp of a sparrow outside. Chloe pulled up a chair across from him, her eyes searching his. "We should tell someone," she said. "Maybe the police or—" "Or what?" Jordan interrupted, his frustration boiling over. "What are they going to do? Write up a report? Tell me to lock my doors?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Whoever they are, Chloe, they're not just some bored strangers. They know where I live. They've been watching me. I don't think the police can do anything about this." Chloe's lips tightened into a thin line, but she said nothing. She was stubborn, just like their late mother, but she knew when to leave an argument alone. Jordan rubbed his temples, feeling the exhaustion settle deep in his bones. "I just need to figure this out," he said, more to himself than to her, "before it gets worse." The day dragged on, and Jordan found himself on the familiar trails of the Maplewood Nature Reserve, hoping that work could offer him some sense of normalcy. The rustling leaves and the calls of distant birds were usually a comfort, but today, even the forest felt off. The weight of the past few days pressed harder with every step. His radio crackled to life, breaking the uneasy quiet. "Jordan, you there?" It was Tyler Scott, his childhood friend and a local contractor, who often volunteered for search and rescue missions. Jordan lifted the radio to his mouth. "Yeah, I'm here. Got a weird one for you," Tyler said, his voice colored with equal parts humor and confusion. "You know that trail near the old oak grove? There's a tent set up just off the path. Brand new. Nobody in it, but looks like someone left in a hurry. Thought you'd want to check it out." Jordan's gut twisted. "On my way." When he arrived, Tyler was crouched next to the abandoned tent, a frown on his usually cheerful face. The tent was pristine, the kind you'd see in a fancy outdoor catalog, but the flap hung open, revealing a scattered mess of belongings. Half-eaten food, a flashlight still on, clothes strewn about. Jordan crouched beside Tyler, examining the scene. "Looks like whoever was here ran off fast," he said, his voice low. Tyler nodded, glancing at his friend. "Think it's connected to that car you've been talking about?" Jordan didn't answer. His mind was racing, connecting dots he didn't want to acknowledge. Whoever had camped here had been afraid. He recognized that kind of desperation. "What do you think?" Tyler pressed, his blue eyes narrowing with concern. Jordan stood, his jaw tightening. "I think we need to find out who this belongs to." Tyler nodded, but the worry never left his face. "Just be careful, man," he said, clapping Jordan on the shoulder. "I don't like the way this feels." Jordan didn't like it either. By the time evening rolled around, Jordan was mentally and physically exhausted. He found himself gravitating toward the Maplewood eatery, needing the comfort of familiar faces. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pancakes drifted through the air as he walked in, and Mrs. Harper greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rough day?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. Jordan nodded, feeling the warmth seep into his cold hands. "Yeah, you could say that." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You know, people have been talking about that black SUV. It's not just you they're watching, you know. Others have seen it parked around town. Makes a person wonder." Jordan's stomach churned. "Who else?" Mrs. Harper looked around, as if making sure no one was listening. "The old Johnson place, even near the high school, where Chloe works. Be careful, Jordan. Whatever this is, it's bigger than just one person." Jordan's grip tightened on his coffee mug. The thought of Chloe being watched, of this darkness spreading to the people he loved, made his fear turn to anger. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever was coming. But before he could respond, the door to the eatery swung open, and in walked a familiar face. Lila Emerson. She looked different from the night he'd helped her, more put together, but still carrying an air of exhaustion, like a woman who'd been running for far too long. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to blur. Lila approached him slowly, her gaze filled with an urgency that made his heart pound. "Jordan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk. Now." Jordan stared at Lila Emerson, her presence in the Maplewood eatery, a jarring reminder of the chaos that had taken over his once quiet life. Her eyes were wide, desperate, like a hunted animal who had run out of places to hide. He didn't hesitate. Setting down his coffee, he stood, nodding toward the corner booth where they could speak privately. Lila moved quickly, her gaze flicking around the diner as if she expected someone to burst through the door and drag her away. Once they were seated, Jordan leaned in, his voice low and urgent. "Talk to me. What's going on?" Lila swallowed, her hands trembling as she ran them through her hair. "I didn't want to come back," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But I had no choice. You need to understand, Jordan. This isn't just about me anymore. They know you helped me." Jordan's pulse quickened. "Who are they, Lila? And why are they following me?" She took a shaky breath, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "The people I've been running from, they're powerful, connected in ways you can't imagine. I was working on a documentary," she explained, her voice growing steadier, "exposing corruption within a corporate empire. I uncovered evidence that could ruin them, and when they found out, they came for me." Jordan felt a chill run down his spine. "So you ran?" She nodded, her eyes distant. "I thought I could hide, blend in, disappear. But then you stopped to help me that night. I didn't realize how much danger I was putting you in until it was too late." Jordan clenched his fists under the table, anger and fear warring within him. He thought back to that night, the way Lila had looked at him, her voice cracking with fear. "So what do we do?" he asked, his voice thick with determination. "How do we fix this?" Lila shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know," she whispered. "They're relentless, and now they're watching you too. They want to make sure no one stands in their way." The words settled over Jordan like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. He had always been the protector, the one who kept others safe. But now, the people he cared about were in danger, and he wasn't sure he could protect them from something this big. A loud crash from the kitchen startled them both. Lila flinched, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Jordan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "Hey," he said softly, "you're safe here. We'll figure this out." But even as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. The walls of Maplewood, once a fortress of familiarity, now felt paper-thin. The day dragged on, and Jordan found himself on the familiar trails of the Maplewood Nature Reserve, hoping that work could offer him some sense of normalcy. The rustling leaves and the calls of distant birds were usually a comfort, but today, even the forest felt off. The weight of the past few days pressed harder with every step. His radio crackled to life, breaking the uneasy quiet. "Jordan, you there?" It was Tyler Scott, his childhood friend and a local contractor, who often volunteered for search and rescue missions. Jordan lifted the radio to his mouth. "Yeah, I'm here." "Got a weird one for you," Tyler said, his voice colored with equal parts humor and confusion. "You know that trail near the old oak grove? There's a tent set up just off the path. Brand new. Nobody in it, but it looks like someone left in a hurry. Thought you'd want to check it out." Jordan's gut twisted. "On my way." When he arrived, Tyler was crouched next to the abandoned tent, a frown on his usually cheerful face. The tent was pristine, the kind you'd see in a fancy outdoor catalog, but the flap hung open, revealing a scattered mess of belongings, half-eaten food, a flashlight still on, clothes strewn about. Jordan crouched beside Tyler, examining the scene. "Looks like whoever was here ran off fast," he said, his voice low. Tyler nodded, glancing at his friend. "Think it's connected to that car you've been talking about?" Jordan didn't answer. His mind was racing, connecting dots he didn't want to acknowledge. Whoever had camped here had been afraid. He recognized that kind of desperation. "What do you think?" Tyler pressed, his blue eyes narrowing with concern. Jordan stood, his jaw tightening. "I think we need to find out who this belongs to." Tyler nodded, but the worry never left his face. "Just be careful, man," he said, clapping Jordan on the shoulder. "I don't like the way this feels." Jordan didn't like it either. By the time evening rolled around, Jordan was mentally and physically exhausted. He found himself gravitating toward the Maplewood eatery, needing the comfort of familiar faces. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pancakes drifted through the air as he walked in, and Mrs. Harper greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Rough day?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. Jordan nodded, feeling the warmth seep into his cold hands. "Yeah, You could say that. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. You know, people have been talking about that black SUV. It's not just you they're watching, you know. Others have seen it parked around town. Makes a person wonder. Jordan's stomach churned. Who else? Mrs. Harper looked around, as if making sure no one was listening. The old Johnson place, even near the high school where Chloe works. Be careful, Jordan. Whatever this is, it's bigger than just one person. Jordan's grip tightened on his coffee mug. The thought of Chloe being watched, of this darkness spreading to the people he loved, made his fear turn to anger. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever was coming. But before he could respond, the door to the eatery swung open, and in walked a familiar face, Lila Emerson. She looked different from the night he'd helped her, more put together, but still carrying an air of exhaustion, like a woman who'd been running for far too long. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world around them seemed to blur. Lila approached him slowly, her gaze filled with an urgency that made his heart pound. Jordan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk. Now. The words left Lila's lips with a desperation that clung to Jordan, making his heart race. He didn't hesitate. He led her out of the eatery and into the cold night air, his mind already running through 1,000 scenarios. The stars above Maplewood glittered, indifferent to the fear that seemed to swallow the small town whole. They didn't speak until they were at his truck, where Jordan turned to Lila. What is it? He asked, his voice taut. What do you need to tell me? Lila looked over her shoulder, her breath misting in the chilly air. We're not safe here, she said, her voice cracking. They know everything. Every person I've ever come in contact with, every friend, every place I've tried to hide. They're watching, Jordan. And now you, your sister, your entire life is in danger. Jordan clenched his jaw, a surge of protectiveness swelling in his chest. Then we'll do what we have to, he said. We'll get ahead of them. But Lila shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. You don't understand. These people aren't just some thugs. They have influence, resources. They can make people disappear. The words hung between them, thick with the weight of unspoken terrors. Jordan took a breath, his grip tightening on his keys. Then we'll have to be smarter, he said. And we won't do it alone. They climbed into the truck, and Jordan drove through the quiet streets of Maplewood, the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. His mind was a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. He needed to rally the people he trusted most. He drove toward his home, where Chloe would be waiting, the last threads of normalcy clinging to the hope that they could still protect the people they loved. When they arrived, Chloe was sitting on the porch, her arms crossed against the cold. She stood up as they approached, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Lila. What's going on? She demanded, her voice steady but tinged with fear. Jordan stepped forward, his heart heavy. Chloe, we need to talk. Inside, they gathered around the small living room, the walls feeling far too close. Lila explained everything, her investigation, the secrets she uncovered, the danger that had spiraled out of control. Chloe listened, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and finally to resolve. So what do we do? Chloe asked, her voice strong despite the fear Jordan knew she must feel. Jordan looked at his sister, pride swelling in his chest. Even in the face of danger, she was unbreakable. We have to bring this out into the open, he said. Expose them before they can bury us. Lila's eyes widened. You don't know what you're saying, she whispered. If we go public, they'll come for us even harder. Jordan leaned forward, his voice steady. If we stay silent, they win. But if we can get the right people to listen, maybe we have a chance. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the creaking of the old house. Chloe reached out, placing her hand over Lila's. Then we fight, she said. For Maplewood, for everything we care about. Lila's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, though her fear was palpable. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Just as the last words left her lips, a loud bang echoed from outside, shattering the fragile sense of safety they had clung to. Jordan sprang to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest, as he grabbed the baseball bat he had kept by the door. Chloe clutched Lila's hand, her face pale. Stay here, Jordan ordered, his voice low but firm. He stepped onto the porch, the night air biting at his skin. The silence that followed was suffocating, every shadow seeming to hold a threat. His breath came in shallow bursts as he scanned the yard, his grip on the bat tightening. "Show yourself," he called out, his voice echoing into the night. For a moment there was nothing. Then a figure stepped out of the shadows, hands raised in surrender. Jordan's heart skipped a beat as he recognized Tyler Scott, his friend's face pale under the moonlight. "Tyler?" Jordan lowered the bat, his relief short-lived. "What the hell are you doing?" Tyler's eyes darted around, and he moved closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "I came to warn you," he said. "People are talking. That black SUV? It's been seen near your sister's school, near the diner. I don't know who they are, but they're not messing around." Jordan's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Tyler swallowed, the fear in his eyes mirroring Jordan's own. "I mean, you need to watch your back," he said. "They're not just following you. They're making sure the whole town knows you're a target." The gravity of the situation sank in, and Jordan's grip on the bat loosened. He glanced back at the house where Chloe and Lila were waiting, and his resolve hardened. "Thanks for the warning," he said, his voice steady. "But we're not backing down." Tyler hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Then be careful," he said. "You're not the only one they're watching." With that, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Jordan standing on the porch, the weight of his friend's words pressing down on him. He took a breath, forcing himself to calm down before heading back inside. When he stepped into the house, Lila and Chloe looked at him, their eyes wide with worry. Jordan set the bat down, his hands trembling. "We need to move fast," he said. "If they're watching the whole town, we have to be ready for anything." Lila nodded, her fear giving way to determination. "I have a contact," she said. "Someone who might be able to get our story out. But we have to be careful. If they catch wind of what we're planning—" Jordan cut her off, his voice firm. "We'll be careful," he said. "But we're not running anymore." Chloe stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Then let's do this," she said. "Together." The next few days were a blur of hushed conversations and stolen moments. Jordan and Chloe worked tirelessly, enlisting the help of those they trusted most. Tyler kept an eye on the movements of the black SUV, while Mrs. Harper spread the word discreetly among the townsfolk, rallying quiet support. Lila worked on compiling her evidence, her fingers flying across the keyboard of Jordan's old laptop. Her determination was infectious, but Jordan couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Every time the phone rang or a shadow passed the window, his heart raced, expecting the worst. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Chloe approached him, her face drawn with worry. "What if this doesn't work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we can't stop them?" Jordan looked at his sister, his own fear reflected in her eyes. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll keep fighting," he said. "No matter what, because giving up isn't an option." Chloe nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, her jaw set with determination. "Okay," she said, "I'm with you." That night, as they sat around the kitchen table, the weight of their plan pressing down on them, Lila looked up from her laptop. "It's done," she said, her voice trembling. "I've sent everything to my contact. Now we wait." The silence that followed was thick with tension, each of them holding their breath, waiting for the storm that was sure to come. Jordan reached for Lila's hand, squeezing it gently. "We did everything we could," he said. "Now we just have to trust that it'll be enough." But even as he spoke the words, a feeling of dread settled in his chest. The shadows outside seemed to grow darker, and the night felt heavy with the weight of something coming, something they couldn't stop. A knock at the door shattered the fragile quiet. They all jumped, their eyes wide with fear. Jordan grabbed the bat, his hands sweating as he moved toward the door. Chloe and Lila stayed behind, holding each other, their faces pale. Jordan took a deep breath and opened the door, his heart pounding. Standing there was a man he didn't recognize, tall, with a sharp suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good evening," the man said, his voice smooth and cold. "I believe we need to have a conversation." The man's smile was the kind that made Jordan's skin crawl. His polished demeanor and calm voice seemed out of place on the creaking, weather-worn porch of a simple Maplewood home. Jordan's grip tightened around the baseball bat he held at his side, the weight of it grounding him against the overwhelming unease that threatened to swallow him whole. "Who are you?" Jordan demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't flinch, didn't so much as blink. His gaze was cold and unyielding, like a snake waiting to strike. "My name is Lawrence," he said, his smile never wavering. "I'm here on behalf of some concerned parties." Jordan's pulse raced. Every instinct in his body screamed that this man was dangerous, that he wasn't here to negotiate or reason. Behind him, he could hear Chloe and Lila holding their breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on them all. "I don't care who you work for," Jordan said, his voice rough. "You're not welcome here. Leave now, or I'll make you." Lawrence raised an eyebrow, as if amused by the threat. "I wouldn't be so hasty," he replied smoothly. "You see, the people I represent don't take kindly to loose ends, and you, Mr. Blake, have become quite a nuisance." Jordan's jaw tightened. "If you think you can intimidate us, you're wrong." Lawrence tilted his head, his expression one of mock disappointment. "Intimidation? No, I'm simply here to make you an offer." His eyes flicked to the open doorway, where he could just make out Chloe and Lila. "An offer to protect the ones you love." Jordan felt his stomach drop, a cold rage coursing through him. "You don't get to threaten my family," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Lawrence sighed as if Jordan were a child who simply didn't understand. "It's not a threat," he said. "It's a promise. Cooperate, and your sister, your friend, your whole little town, they stay safe. Refuse and, well, accidents happen." Chloe couldn't hold back any longer. She stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "Get out," she snapped, her voice strong and unyielding. "You don't scare us." Lawrence's smile finally faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Brave," he said almost admiringly. "But bravery won't save you. Only cooperation will." Jordan had had enough. He took a step forward, lifting the bat. "I'm not afraid to use this," he said, his voice shaking with barely contained anger. Lawrence took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Very well," he said. "You've made your choice. But remember this, Mr. Blake. We always get what we want, one way or another." With that, he turned and strode down the porch steps, disappearing into the darkness. The tension in the air lingered long after he was gone, wrapping around the small house like a vice. Jordan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hands shaking as he set the bat down. Chloe rushed to his side, her eyes wide with fear. "Jordan, what are we going to do?" she whispered. Jordan swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. "We stick to the plan," he said, though the doubt in his voice was unmistakable. "We fight back." Lila stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "He's right," she said. "We can't let them scare us into silence. We have to finish what we started." The resolve in her voice was enough to steel Jordan's nerves. He looked at his sister, his heart aching with the weight of his responsibility. "We're going to protect each other," he said. "No matter what." The hours dragged on, each second heavy with the knowledge that they were being watched, hunted. Jordan, Chloe, and Lila worked tirelessly, reaching out to their allies in town. Tyler was their most dedicated supporter, his loyalty unwavering despite the danger. Mrs. Harper kept an eye on the comings and goings in Maplewood, her network of gossip and information proving invaluable. But the pressure never let up. Every knock on the door, every flicker of headlights passing by, felt like a countdown to something terrible. Jordan barely slept, his mind racing with plans and contingencies, none of which felt good enough. One night, as he sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, Chloe approached him. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, and he looked up to see her eyes glistening with tears. "Jordan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared." He reached up, covering her hand with his own. "I know," he said, his voice thick. "I am too." She sank into the chair beside him, her shoulders trembling. "Do you think we're going to make it?" she asked, the vulnerability in her voice cutting through him like a knife. Jordan took a deep breath, fighting to keep his composure. "We have to," he said, "for each other." Chloe leaned into him, and for a moment they were just two siblings clinging to each other, the weight of the world pressing down on them. The sound of Lila typing on the laptop filled the silence, a fragile reminder that they were still fighting, still holding on. The next morning, the tension boiled over. Tyler burst through the door, his face flushed and eyes wild. "They took him!" he gasped, his voice cracking. "They took my dad!" Jordan jumped to his feet, his heart slamming against his ribs. "What do you mean?" he demanded. Tyler's hands were shaking as he tried to catch his breath. "My dad was on his way to work," he said, his voice thick with panic. "A black SUV pulled up, and they dragged him away. No one's seen him since." The horror in Tyler's eyes sent a wave of fury crashing through Jordan. "We have to do something," he said, his voice breaking. Lila stood, her face pale but resolute. "We need to expose them now," she said, "before they hurt anyone else." Chloe looked at her brother, her eyes wide with fear. "But how? If we go public, they could come for us too." Jordan clenched his fists, his mind racing. "We have to take that risk," he said. "We can't let them keep hurting people. We need to show the world who they really are." Tyler's shoulders slumped, the weight of his father's abduction crushing him. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice raw with pain. "Just tell me what to do." Jordan looked at his friends, the people who had become his family, and felt a surge of determination. They had been pushed to the brink, but they were still standing. And as long as they were standing, they had a chance. The next few days were a whirlwind of desperation and courage. Lila worked tirelessly, sending the evidence to every journalist, every organization she could think of. They recorded video statements, exposing the corruption and danger they had uncovered. The stakes were higher than ever, but so was their resolve. One evening, as they sat together in the dim light of the living room, Chloe looked around at her makeshift family. "No matter what happens," she said, her voice steady, "I'm glad I'm with you." Jordan reached for her hand, his heart aching with love and fear. "Me too," he said, his voice breaking. Lila wiped away a tear, her expression fierce. "We're going to finish this," she said, "together." But even as they made their stand, the shadows grew closer, and the storm they had tried so hard to outrun was about to break. The house was suffocatingly quiet, every second ticking by like a countdown to something inevitable. Jordan sat on the edge of the worn couch, gripping the baseball bat so hard his knuckles turned white. Across from him, Lila hammered away on her laptop, her face pale and strained as she sent the last of the evidence to journalists and allies. "It's done," she whispered, shutting the laptop with trembling hands. "Now we wait." Jordan nodded, though he felt no relief. The fear of what came next was a suffocating weight, pressing down on all of them. Chloe hovered by the kitchen counter, eyes wide with dread. Tyler paced the room, his fingers drumming against his thigh. A knock at the door shattered the fragile silence. Jordan shot to his feet, heart pounding as he signaled for the others to stay back. He approached the door slowly, bat in hand. With a deep breath, he yanked it open, only to find Mrs. Harper standing there, eyes wild with fear. "They're here," she said, her voice cracking. "At the community center, black SUVs. They're asking for you." Jordan's stomach twisted. "Thank you," he managed. "Go home. Lock your doors." Mrs. Harper's eyes glistened with worry. "Be careful, Jordan. We're all behind you." She hurried away, and Jordan closed the door, turning back to the others. "They're at the community center," he said. "We have to move. Now." The next few minutes were a flurry of movement. They grabbed bags and whatever they could carry. Jordan's voice was steady but tight with urgency. "We split up. Tyler, take Chloe to the old barn on Thompson Road. Lila and I will draw them away." Chloe's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not leaving you," she choked out. Jordan hugged her fiercely. "You have to," he whispered. "I need you safe." Her hands clenched around his shirt, but she nodded, swallowing her fear. "Come back to me." He forced a smile, though his heart was breaking. "I will." Jordan and Lila ran through the woods, the roar of engines echoing behind them. The black SUVs were closing in, headlights slicing through the darkness. They reached the old bridge over Maplewood Creek, only to find Lawrence waiting for them, a cruel smile on his face. "Going somewhere," he sneered. Jordan stepped in front of Lila, bat raised. "We're not stopping. You can't silence the truth." Lawrence signaled his men, who advanced like wolves. But before they could reach Jordan and Lila, the woods came alive with light and sound. Townsfolk emerged, armed with rifles, flashlights, and unwavering resolve. Tyler led the charge, his voice ringing out, "This is our town. We protect our own." Lawrence's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "This isn't over," he spat before retreating with his men. The people of Maplewood held their ground, a wall of defiance. Jordan's heart swelled with gratitude, the relief overwhelming. Chloe ran to him, and he pulled her into a hug, tears streaming down both their faces. Lila's voice broke the moment. "We did it," she said, her tears glistening. "We really did." Jordan looked at his friends, his town, and knew that together they could face whatever came next. The chill of the early morning air pressed against the town of Maplewood, but the warmth of unity burned brightly within its people. Despite the small victory, Jordan knew the fight was far from over. He and Lila stood on the old bridge, looking out over the creek as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting everything in gold. Lila's voice was barely above a whisper. "How long do you think we have before they come back?" Jordan rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Not long," he admitted. "But we're not alone. That has to count for something." Lila nodded, her eyes tired but determined. The events of the past few days had aged them all, but there was a flicker of hope in the way the town had come together, standing side by side against a threat much larger than any of them could have imagined. They made their way back to Jordan's home, where Chloe, Tyler, and a small group of neighbors had gathered. Mrs. Harper was passing out mugs of steaming coffee, her usual warmth clouded by worry. The air was thick with uncertainty, but the town's spirit was unbroken. Chloe was the first to see Jordan and Lila approach. She ran to her brother, relief flooding her face. "Thank God," she breathed, pulling him into a tight hug. "I was starting to think—" Jordan held her close, his voice cracking. "I'm here," he said, though the unspoken fear between them lingered. Tyler approached, a determined set to his jaw. "We need a plan," he said, his voice firm. "They won't stay gone for long." Lila stepped forward, her gaze meeting Jordan's. "We have to make this story impossible to ignore," she said. "The more eyes we have on us, the harder it'll be for them to silence us." Tyler nodded, clapping a hand on Jordan's shoulder. "We're with you, whatever it takes." Jordan's heart swelled with gratitude. He looked around at the people who had become his family, the neighbors who had shown up to fight for what was right, and knew that together they were stronger than any force trying to tear them apart. The hours flew by as they worked to spread their message. Lila and a few tech-savvy teens from the high school worked tirelessly to create a digital campaign, sharing their story far and wide. Journalists had already begun to take interest, and soon news vans lined the streets of Maplewood, eager to capture the tale of a small town fighting back against corruption. Jordan barely had time to catch his breath, running from one meeting to the next. He gave interviews, stood in front of cameras, and spoke with a conviction that surprised even himself. His voice trembled at times, but he never wavered. The people of Maplewood needed him to be strong, and he wouldn't let them down. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, Jordan found a moment of quiet in his backyard. He sat on the steps, the cool air brushing against his skin. Chloe joined him, sinking down beside him with a sigh. "You did good today," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Jordan gave her a small, tired smile. "I hope it's enough," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. Chloe bumped her shoulder against his, a gesture they had shared since they were kids. "It is," she said. "No matter what happens, you've already done more than anyone could have asked for." He turned to look at her, his heart aching with the weight of everything they had been through. "I just want to keep you safe," he said. "All of you." Chloe reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "And you have," she whispered. "You've given us hope." Just as the moment of peace began to settle in, the sound of an engine approaching shattered the calm. Jordan was on his feet in an instant, his heart pounding as headlights cut through the gathering darkness. He and Chloe ran around to the front yard, where the entire town seemed to hold its breath. A lone car pulled up, and to Jordan's surprise, a familiar figure stepped out. Chief Warren, the town's police chief. His uniform was rumpled, and his face was lined with stress, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "Chief?" Jordan called out, his voice cautious. Chief Warren walked up, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I heard what happened," he said, his voice weary but firm. "And I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner." Jordan's brow furrowed, disbelief warring with hope. "You believe us?" The chief's gaze swept over the crowd, taking in the tired but defiant faces of the townsfolk. "I've seen enough to know something's wrong," he said. "I want to help, but we have to be smart about this." The crowd erupted into murmurs, a mix of relief and skepticism. Mrs. Harper stepped forward, her arms crossed. "And why should we trust you now, after all this time?" she demanded. Chief Warren met her gaze, his jaw tight. "Because I've realized this isn't just about me or the badge I wear," he said. "It's about this town, about all of us. I want to make things right." Jordan stepped forward, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. "Then let's work together," he said. "We need every ally we can get." The chief nodded, and for the first time in days, a small spark of hope flared to life in Jordan's chest. They had a long road ahead, but they weren't fighting alone. As the night wore on, plans were made. The townsfolk worked alongside the police, setting up patrols and keeping watch for any sign of danger. Chief Warren used his connections to push for more media coverage, and soon the story of Maplewood's fight for justice began to spread even further. Lila sat on the porch steps, her head resting on her knees, as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Jordan joined her, his own fatigue weighing heavily on him. "Think we'll ever sleep again?" he asked, his voice dry with humor. Lila managed a tired smile. "Maybe," she said, "when this is all over." They sat in companionable silence, the air filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Despite the fear and uncertainty, there was a sense of unity, of people coming together for something bigger than themselves. Lila turned to Jordan, her eyes soft. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "For everything." Jordan's throat tightened, and he reached for her hand, their fingers entwining. "We did this together," he said, "and we're going to finish it together." As they sat there, the first stars began to appear in the sky, tiny beacons of light in the darkness. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jordan allowed himself to believe that they had a chance. The night in Maplewood was alive with a nervous energy, every whisper of wind and rustling leaf setting nerves on edge. Jordan stood on the porch, staring out into the darkness, the old baseball bat still by his side. Beside him, Lila adjusted her glasses, her eyes red from exhaustion but sharp with determination. They had fought so hard to get this far, and yet the knowledge that they were far from safe kept gnawing at them. The enemy they faced was still powerful, still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jordan took a steadying breath, trying to keep his fear in check. "I never imagined it would come to this," he said, his voice low. "Fighting like this, just to keep our town safe." Lila gave him a tired smile. "Sometimes the smallest places hold the greatest stories," she said, "and the most courageous people." Jordan couldn't help but return her smile, but before he could respond, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the street. He tensed, raising the bat, but Chief Warren emerged from the shadows, a flashlight in hand. "Everything's quiet for now," the chief reported, his expression grave. "But I don't trust that it'll stay that way for long." Jordan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Neither do I. Thank you for being here, Chief." The older man's face softened. "It's my duty," he said, though his voice held a hint of regret. "And I should have done more sooner." There was a silence, thick with unspoken apologies and new alliances forged in fear and necessity. But before the moment could stretch on, Tyler ran up, his face flushed with urgency. "They're back," he said, breathless. "The black SUVs. They're circling the outskirts of town." Panic rippled through the group, but Jordan forced himself to stay calm. "Okay," he said, his voice stronger than he felt. "We stick to the plan. Everyone to their positions." The people of Maplewood had prepared for this, setting up safe zones and communication lines. Families gathered in the church, which had been turned into a refuge, while those willing to fight took up posts around the perimeter of town. It was a strategy born of desperation, but it was all they had. Jordan and Lila made their way to the town square, where a small group of defenders waited. Chloe was there, her face pale but resolute, a makeshift weapon in hand. Mrs. Harper stood beside her, a fierce determination burning in her eyes. Jordan's heart ached at the sight of his sister. "You should be at the church," he said, his voice breaking. Chloe shook her head, her grip tightening around the metal rod she held. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We stand together." A lump formed in Jordan's throat, but he knew there was no time to argue. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle despite the tension in his muscles. "Okay," he whispered, "but stay close." The tension in the air was palpable, every creak of wood and whisper of wind making them jump. The SUVs had stopped moving, their engines rumbling like thunder in the distance. It felt like the calm before a storm, and every second stretched out into an eternity. Lila glanced at Jordan, her voice barely audible. "If this goes wrong—" Jordan cut her off, his voice steady. "It won't," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. "We won't let it." But just as the words left his mouth, the night erupted into chaos. The SUVs roared forward, headlights blazing as they barreled down the main road. Men in dark suits spilled out, their faces cold and unyielding as they approached. Chief Warren stepped forward, his voice booming over the noise. "This is Maplewood," he declared, "and we won't stand for this." One of the men, a tall figure with a scar running down his cheek, sneered. "Step aside, Chief," he said. "This doesn't concern you." The chief stood his ground, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "It concerns all of us," he said, his voice unwavering. "We protect our own." A standoff ensued, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jordan gripped his bat, his palms sweating as he prepared for the worst. But before violence could break out, the sound of sirens cut through the night. The news crews and journalists they had called were arriving, cameras rolling and lights flashing. The men in suits hesitated, their confidence faltering. Lila's voice rang out, clear and defiant. "You can't hide this anymore," she said, stepping forward. "The world is watching." The scarred man's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, his jaw clenching as he realized they had lost control of the situation. The arrival of the media had turned the tide, and the shadowy power they wielded no longer seemed as absolute. For a moment, it felt as though they might have won. But then, in a desperate attempt to regain control, one of the men lunged forward, grabbing Lila. Jordan's heart stopped, and without thinking, he swung the bat, the impact reverberating through his arms. The man staggered, releasing Lila, but the chaos that followed was a blur of movement and noise. People shouted, the crowd surging forward as the townsfolk defended their own. Jordan fought with everything he had, his only thought to protect the people he loved. Chloe was beside him, swinging her makeshift weapon with a fierceness he had never seen before. Mrs. Harper yelled commands, organizing the townsfolk like a seasoned general, and through it all, Lila stayed close, her presence a reminder of why they were fighting. Finally, as the dawn broke over Maplewood, the men in suits retreated, their SUVs speeding away into the morning light. The town was battered and bruised, but they had held their ground. Jordan fell to his knees, the bat slipping from his grip as exhaustion and relief washed over him. Chloe knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We really did it." Jordan pulled her into a hug, his own tears falling freely. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse. "We did." Lila stood beside them, her eyes shining with exhaustion and hope. "They'll think twice before coming back," she said, though they all knew the fight wasn't truly over. But for now, they had won. The town of Maplewood had stood together, and in that unity, they had found strength. Jordan looked around at the people he loved, the community he had fought for, and knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The first rays of sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, a promise of a new day, and as Jordan stood with his sister and his friends, he let himself believe in that promise, because hope, after all, was the strongest weapon they had. The morning sun spread golden light across Maplewood, but it did little to ease the tension still hanging thick in the air. Jordan sat on the remains of a shattered bench, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. Chloe hovered nearby, bruises and cuts marring her face, but her eyes held a fierce determination. "We made it through," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "We showed them we won't be silenced." Jordan managed a tired smile. "Yeah," he said, "but they'll come back. We can't let our guard down." Lila approached with her phone clutched tightly in her hands, her face pale. "The story is spreading," she announced, her voice a mix of hope and fear. "Journalists are picking it up. We've got more eyes on us now." Jordan felt a flicker of hope. "That's good," he said, though the dread never fully left him. "The more attention, the harder it'll be for them to act without consequences." Tyler, with a makeshift bandage around his arm, joined them. "We did what we could," he said. "Now we have to be ready for whatever comes next." Throughout the day, Maplewood's townsfolk worked together, boarding up windows and clearing debris. There was a sense of unity, but also a shared anxiety that made every sound seem louder, every shadow darker. Jordan helped old Mr. Dunham nail plywood over a broken window, the older man's hands trembling from fatigue. "Never thought I'd see this in my lifetime," Mr. Dunham muttered. "But I'm proud of you kids. You've got more courage than most." Jordan's throat tightened. "We have to protect what we love," he replied. His phone buzzed then, a text from Lila. "Meet me by the old willow. It's urgent." The old willow tree had always been a place of comfort, a reminder of better days. Now it felt like the only place left untouched by the chaos. Jordan made his way there, his heart heavy with anticipation. Lila stood under the sprawling branches, her eyes wide with fear. "I got a message," she said, her voice cracking. "From someone who says they're an insider. They want to meet tonight at the old railway depot." Jordan's stomach twisted. "It could be a trap." "I know," Lila replied. "But if it's real, we need to hear them out." He exhaled, fear clenching his chest. "Then we go together," he said. "But we prepare for the worst." Night fell over Maplewood like a heavy blanket, wrapping the town in darkness. Jordan, Lila, Tyler, and Chloe made their way to the abandoned railway depot. The old structure loomed ahead, rusted and crumbling, an eerie monument to forgotten times. A lone lantern cast a circle of light inside, where a young man stood, shadows etched deep into his face. "My name is Sam," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I worked for them. I have evidence, proof of everything they've done." He handed Lila a battered envelope. "But be careful," he warned. "They're watching. They'll do anything to keep this buried." Jordan's grip on the baseball bat tightened. "Why are you helping us?" Sam's eyes were haunted. "Because I've seen too much. I need to make this right." Lila clutched the envelope, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she whispered. Sam's voice was grave. "Good luck," he said. "You'll need it." As they left the depot, the envelope felt like both a gift and a curse. They had a chance now, but also a target on their backs. Jordan looked at his friends, their faces determined despite the fear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And under the star-strewn sky, he dared to believe they could win. The air in Maplewood felt heavy, as if the very town was holding its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. Jordan, Lila, Chloe, and Tyler gathered in the dimly lit living room of Jordan's small cottage, the battered envelope lying like a forbidden artifact on the coffee table between them. Lila's hands hovered over it, the tremor in her fingers betraying the weight of what they had just received. "We have to open it," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Jordan nodded, his jaw set. "We need to know what we're up against." With a deep breath, Lila broke the seal. The room fell silent as she pulled out a stack of papers, each one a damning piece of evidence. Bank statements, confidential memos, signed orders. It was all there, proof of corruption that ran deep and dangerous. Tyler leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. This could take them down," he said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "It's everything we've been looking for." But Jordan's gut twisted. "And it makes us more of a target than ever," he said grimly. "We have to move fast. If they realize we have this, they won't hold back." Chloe's face paled, but she set her jaw. "So what do we do?" Jordan's mind raced, his heart pounding. "We go public," he said. "We release it to as many people as possible. Make sure it can't be silenced." Lila nodded, already reaching for her laptop. I'll start uploading it, she said. But we need a backup plan, just in case. The hours ticked by in a blur of frantic activity. Lila worked tirelessly, encrypting the files and sending them to trusted journalists and activists. Jordan and Tyler set up watch outside, their eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of danger. It was nearly dawn when Chloe joined Jordan on the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You haven't slept," she said, her voice gentle but worried. Jordan shook his head, the weight of responsibility pressing on him like a boulder. "I can't," he said, "not with everything at stake." Chloe placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm. "You're doing everything you can," she said. "We all are. You're not alone." The words sank into him, a balm against the fear gnawing at his insides. He turned to his sister, the girl he had raised, and felt a surge of love and pride. "I just want to protect you," he whispered. Chloe's eyes glistened, but she held her head high. "We protect each other," she said. "That's what family does." Just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a sudden noise shattered the stillness. A car engine, growing louder, coming closer. Jordan's entire body tensed, and he gripped the bat he had kept at his side. Tyler was on his feet in an instant, his rifle ready. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The car door opened, and out stepped a man they had never seen before. Tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes that glinted like steel. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm here to talk," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "My name is Marcus Hayes. I represent certain interests that have become very interested in Maplewood." Jordan's grip tightened on the bat. "What kind of interests?" he demanded, his voice hard. Marcus's gaze swept over them, taking in their worn faces, the weapons they clutched, the exhaustion that lined their features. "The kind that doesn't want any more bloodshed," he said. "But we need to reach an understanding." Lila stepped out of the house, her eyes flashing with defiance. "An understanding?" she repeated. "After everything you've done to us?" Marcus's expression didn't waver. "I'm here to offer a deal," he said. "We'll back off, leave Maplewood in peace, if you stop pursuing this crusade, if you destroy the evidence you have." Jordan's heart pounded, fury and disbelief warring within him. "You think you can just buy our silence?" he said, his voice shaking with anger. "After everything?" Marcus's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, his calm facade cracked. "Think carefully," he said. "You're playing a dangerous game. The people I work for don't like to lose." Jordan stepped forward, his hands trembling, but his resolve unbroken. "We're not afraid of you," he said. "We won't back down." A muscle in Marcus's jaw twitched, but he nodded slowly. "Have it your way," he said. "But remember, when the storm comes, you brought it on yourselves." With that, he turned and got back into the car, the engine roaring to life as he drove away, leaving behind a threat that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Lila exhaled shakily, clutching the papers to her chest. "They're scared," she said, her voice a whisper. "We have them on the ropes." Jordan glanced at his friends, his family, the people he had fought so hard to protect. The battle wasn't over, but they were ready for whatever came next. "Let them come," he said, his voice steady and strong. "We're not backing down. Not now. Not ever." And as the sun rose over Maplewood, bathing the town in light, Jordan felt the fire of hope burning bright within him. They had faced the darkness together, and they would continue to fight, no matter the cost. The morning sky over Maplewood was painted in hues of pink and gold, as if the universe itself was offering the town a promise of hope. The tension from the confrontation with Marcus Hayes still lingered, but a different energy pulsed through the community now, one of unity, resilience, and an unbreakable will to protect what they held dear. Jordan stood in the town square, the cool morning air brushing against his face. The evidence they had gathered was out in the world now, a spark that had ignited a blaze of attention. News crews had arrived, reporters weaving through the square to capture the story of this small town that had taken on giants. Lila was beside him, her eyes red from sleepless nights but shining with a quiet determination. "We did everything we could," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "Now we have to hope it's enough." Jordan nodded, the weight of everything they had fought for pressing on him. But as he looked around, he saw faces filled not with fear, but with courage. Families stood together, neighbors holding hands, children playing as if the world hadn't just tried to crush their home. Chloe approached, her smile soft but proud. "You see that?" she asked, gesturing to the people of Maplewood. "They're stronger because of you, because of all of us." Jordan's throat tightened. "I didn't do this alone," he said. "We all stood together." Chloe took his hand, her touch warm and grounding. "You led us," she said, her voice thick with love and pride. "And we followed because we believe in you." The words hit him like a wave, and he pulled his sister into a hug, holding her tightly. "I just wanted to protect you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "All of you." Chloe hugged him back, her tears dampening his shirt. "You did," she whispered. "You gave us a chance to fight for ourselves." Hours later, a press conference was held in the heart of the town square. Journalists and cameras focused on Jordan, Lila, and Chief Warren as they stood together, a united front. The weight of the moment was almost overwhelming, but Jordan took a deep breath, finding strength in the people beside him. Lila stepped forward, her voice strong and unwavering. "We are Maplewood," she began, her words echoing through the crowd. "A town that refused to be silenced, that refused to be crushed by fear. We stood up not just for ourselves, but for every community that has ever been threatened by corruption and power." Her words drew murmurs of agreement, the crowd hanging onto every syllable. Jordan's heart pounded, but he felt a sense of purpose, a resolve that had been tempered by fire. He stepped up next, his hands trembling slightly. "We were told we were small," he said, his voice carrying over the quiet, "that we couldn't win, but we proved that when we stand together, we are anything but small. We are powerful." Tears pricked at his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. "This fight has cost us," he continued, his voice cracking. "We've faced fear, danger, and loss. But it also showed us who we are, people who care for each other, who lift each other up, and who fight for what's right." The crowd erupted in applause, the noise washing over him like a wave of hope. Jordan stepped back, feeling the warmth of Lila's and Chloe's hands in his own, and knew that no matter what came next, they had made a difference. In the days that followed, the tide truly began to turn. The evidence they had released sparked investigations, and the corrupt forces that had tried to crush Maplewood found themselves under a relentless spotlight. Marcus Hayes and those he represented were forced to retreat, their power weakened by the unrelenting truth. Life in Maplewood slowly returned to normal, but the town was forever changed. There was a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that even the smallest voices could make a difference. Jordan and his friends became symbols of that hope, though they remained humble, knowing they had only done what needed to be done. One afternoon, Jordan sat on the porch of his childhood home, watching the world go by. The air was filled with the laughter of children playing and the distant hum of conversation. Chloe came out, 2 mugs of lemonade in hand, and sat beside him. "You look like you're thinking too much," she teased, handing him a mug. Jordan chuckled, taking a sip. "Just thinking about everything that's happened," he said. "How different things are now." Chloe's smile softened. "Different, but better," she said. "We're stronger because of it." Jordan looked out at the street, at the neighbors who now greeted each other with more warmth, at the way people looked out for one another. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we are." Lila walked up the driveway, her hair pulled back and a camera slung over her shoulder. She grinned at them, a mischievous light in her eyes. "Hey," she said, "you two ready for the town celebration tomorrow? Everyone's expecting a speech from our reluctant hero." Jordan groaned, but he couldn't hide his smile. "I'm not much for speeches," he said, though his heart felt light. Lila sat down on the porch steps, her gaze softening. "You're good at them," she said, "because they come from the heart." The three of them sat there, the weight of their shared experiences settling into something more gentle, something they could carry with pride. They had faced the darkness, and they had won. Not because they were fearless, but because they had chosen to fight, even when the odds were against them. Jordan's voice was quiet but filled with a deep, unshakable truth. "We did good," he said. "No matter what comes next, we did something that mattered." Chloe and Lila exchanged a look, and then Chloe placed her hand over his. "And we'll keep doing it," she said. "Together." The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting everything in a warm golden light. And as Jordan sat there with the people he loved, he felt hope unfurling in his chest, stronger and brighter than ever before. Because in the end, the heart of Maplewood wasn't just the town itself, it was the people who made it home. And as long as they stood together, there was nothing they couldn't face. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and open the mind. Until next time, remember, every story has the power to make a difference, yours included.